Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead and start now. Let me start by welcoming everyone to this evening's program and this webinar series. My name is Faiza Patel. I'm the co-director of the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. And the Brennan Center and our co-sponsoring organizations, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, the APA Justice Task Force, United Chinese Americans, and Asian Pacific Islander American Public Affairs are really happy that you guys are joining us in the third of a series of webinars exploring the human, legal, and scientific costs of the Justice Department's China Initiative. Now, the goal of this webinar in particular is to build a coalition supporting our advocacy work, which is focused on raising attention to the harmful effects of the Justice Department's China Initiative. These effects are felt primarily by the Chinese American community and by academic and scientific institutions. Now, obviously, we recognize that there are legitimate national security and human rights concerns regarding malign behaviors by the Chinese government. Obviously, we've all read the stories about the Chinese government's treatment of the Uyghur population, about how it's treated political protesters in Hong Kong, and economic espionage by the Chinese government is a real thing. It's a real threat. It can harm our security and it can harm our economy. So, these are issues that are appropriate for the US government to focus on and take on. But that doesn't mean that they are sort of permission for policies that sort of treat Chinese Americans as threats in a very sort of blanket, suspicionless way. This is not something new from what the US government has done. It comes from a long history, particularly of the FBI and the Department of Justice, treating some Americans as being less American, if you will. And these are typically, immigrant communities, religious minority communities, communities of color, all of whom are treated as suspects, and their civil rights and their civil liberties are diminished and undermined and violated in the name of national security. So in these previous episodes, particularly earlier in our history, these communities have mostly been left to fend for themselves. And that wasn't the case after 9/11 for sure, where, many of the folks who are going to be talking today really helped step up to defend Muslim American communities. And our goal is to make sure that as we engage with the public and as we engage with policymakers, that we draw on the strength of all of these communities in order to protect every community, because whenever one community is in danger and is being targeted, no community is safe. So we want to make sure that we all work together and we recognize the intersection of our issues. We recognize our interdependence on each other. And that's really what today is about. I want to give a couple of logistical issues. Some of you submitted questions when you registered for this event. If you have other questions during the webinar, you can submit them through the Q&A, and we'll try to incorporate as many of them as possible. They may not sound like exactly the way you phrase your question, but I'm going to try and get to the gist of most of those questions. Keep in mind that the webinar is being recorded and it's going to be available publicly, and your Q&A is also going to be able to be publicly viewed. So with that, let's turn to the evening's, the meat of this evening. We have an amazing panel of experts from both the academic and policy communities with us tonight, including Dr. Karen Korematsu, the founder and executive director of the Fred T. Korematsu Institute, Becky Monroe, who's the director of Fighting Hate and Bias Program at the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights, and Dr. Leslie Wong, who's the President Emeritus, and my pronunciation today is really off, you guys, Emeritus of San Francisco State University. They have long bios, have really rich careers, and I encourage you to look them up, because then you're going to be even more impressed than from just hearing them speak in my short bios. But before we get to the panel, we are really excited to have a special guest to start us off, Representative Judy Chu of California's 27th District. Representative Chu is always on the right side of every issue that I've ever seen. So I'm really thrilled to have you here today. I want to say a couple of things about Representative Chu. In 2009, she was elected as the first Chinese American woman member of Congress. She's the chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific Islander American Caucus, which advocates for the needs and concerns of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders across the nation. She also helps lead the Tri-Caucus as a joint effort with the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. She has been a leader in pushing back against some of the abuses and overreach, really is, I guess, a better word, of the China Initiative, including by writing to FBI Director Wray asking for information as to what was going on with this initiative. And she is really a leader, really across all civil rights and civil liberties issues, and cannot think of a better person to help us understand this moment and what we can do about it as different communities coming together. So Representative Chu, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Faiza. And yes, I am Congressmember Judy Chu, and as the chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, or what we call CAPAC, I want to thank Asian Americans Advancing Justice, the Brennan Center for Justice, the APA Justice Task Force, United Chinese Americans, and the Asian Pacific Islander American Public Affairs for coming together to host this important webinar series. Today's webinar, Discrimination Against Asian Americans, could not come at a more important time. Our community has reached a crisis point that cannot be ignored. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the Asian American community has been terrified by the alarming surge in anti-Asian bigotry across our nation that has resulted in over 3,000 anti-Asian hate crimes and incidents in just the past year alone. That's why last week, CAPAC convened a press conference with Speaker Nancy Pelosi and our colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, who joined us, the Congressional Asian Pacific Caucus, to raise awareness about the surge in anti-Asian violence and to call for action. Beginning in January of last year, long before stay-at-home orders were put in place, Asian Americans were already starting to feel the string of terrible actions occurring due to misinformation and stigma that wrongly associated Asian Americans with the coronavirus. That's why CAPAC held a press conference 1 year ago outside the US Capitol to combat the surge in anti-Asian discrimination we were beginning to see at the time. And we urged every leader to stick to the advice from the World Health Organization and not associate the virus with a specific ethnicity, country, or geographic region due to the stigma it causes. We warn that spreading xenophobia would put lives at risk, but our pleas and the guidance from experts were ignored. Instead, we saw elected officials spread conspiracy theories about how the virus was manufactured in a lab in Wuhan. And because they wanted to shift blame and anger away from their own flawed response to the coronavirus, Donald Trump and his Republican followers made a choice to double down on using slurs like Wuhan virus, China plague, and Kung flu. And that tactic succeeded in directing more hate and blame at the Asian American community. What started out as dirty looks and verbal assaults has escalated to physical attacks and violence against innocent Asian Americans. And most recently, just as many Asian Americans were preparing for the Lunar New Year over the past few weeks, we saw a surge in anti-Asian violence. And the victims have increasingly been older and vulnerable, like Vichar Watanabe, an 84-year-old Thai man in San Francisco, who was killed in an unprovoked assault while on his morning walk. In New York, a 61-year-old Filipino man's face was slashed ear to ear with a knife in the subway. In Oakland, Chinatown, a camera captured a 91-year-old man being thrown to the ground by an assailant who then went to assault 2 more victims. And last week, I learned about a Chinese American man being attacked at a bus stop in my district in Rosemead, California, causing him to lose part of his finger. This is almost becoming a daily tragedy. These attacks are no accident. It was deliberate incitement. And as we know, we cannot be silent in the face of incitement. That's why last year, CAPAC made it a point to call out Donald Trump and his allies every time they stoked xenophobia against the Asian American community. And it's why we push for the passage of Congressmember Grace Meng's resolution to condemn anti-Asian sentiment related to COVID-19, which did pass the House last fall. But unfortunately, the problems of anti-Asian xenophobia and prejudice extends beyond just the past year. Even before the coronavirus pandemic began, we saw the rise of anti-Asian xenophobia through the use of Cold War rhetoric that's become increasingly more prevalent as tensions between the US and China continue to escalate. And while this is not unique to the Trump administration, we saw how anti-China sentiment worsened as Donald Trump and his followers continued to blame China for the coronavirus pandemic. In fact, after Donald Trump announced that he and the former First Lady had coronavirus, we saw a flood of ugly backlash and conspiracy theories online saying that China gave Trump the coronavirus to kill him and that they must be held accountable for the creation of this alleged bioweapon. And we are still hearing these conspiracy theories even to this day. That's why we have urged our colleagues in Congress to be mindful of the language they use when it comes to China. I want to be clear, while we should absolutely acknowledge our differences with the policies of the Chinese Communist Party, we should not blanketly target all Chinese people and promote China bashing that puts Asian American lives at risk. One of the most dire impacts of this increased anti-China rhetoric has been an increase also in the racial profiling of Chinese American students, researchers, engineers, scientists, and federal employees who've been wrongly accused of being spies for China simply because of the way they look. For instance, Temple University professor Xiaosheng Shi and our hydrologist Sherry Chen were both falsely accused by the FBI of being spies for China, only to have their charges dropped without any explanation. They faced humiliating arrests and had their entire lives turned upside down as a result of these false accusations. And they're still seeking justice, but they're not alone. Under the Trump administration's China initiative, we saw more and more Chinese and Chinese Americans becoming fearful that they would be the victims of racial profiling as tensions between the US and China continued to rise. And we've heard stories of Asian American professors and scientists who are being caught up in similar situations at research institutions and on university campuses all across the nation. In fact, just last year, the Department of Justice dropped yet another case against a visiting Chinese scientist at the University of Virginia after wrongly accusing him of illegally accessing university materials, even though this information was included in a shared space that he had authorized access to. And just recently, we saw the case of MIT professor Gang Chen, who was arrested for allegedly failing to report ties to his Chinese government. His MIT colleagues quickly rallied around him and disputed one of the government's assertion that Chen received $29 million in funding, saying that it was actually MIT who was the recipient of this money. So we must continue to remain vigilant. These cases have had a chilling effect on our community. I've heard from so many individuals who are afraid of pursuing a career in science or academia because they fear being falsely accused of spying and worrying that they may be racially profiled simply because they're Chinese. That's not right. And that's why it's important that we do everything we can to ensure our nation's leaders and intelligence community that they do not perpetuate harmful Cold War rhetoric with China. That's why last summer, I also sent a hate crimes toolkit and messaging guidance to every member of Congress, urging them to avoid using Cold War style rhetoric around China and to stop stoking xenophobia that puts Asian Americans at risk. And that's why 1 year ago, Congressman Jamie Raskin and I sent a letter to NIH and FBI raising questions about the increased profiling of Asian American researchers and scientists. Under the Trump administration, we did not receive any answers to our inquiries. So we may have to redo this. And in fact, we are going to readdress this request to the Biden administration. And we are hopeful that President Biden will work with us to address anti-China rhetoric and harmful initiatives that encourage the indiscriminate targeting of our community. We're also working with Congressman Raskin to get answers and are hoping to hold a congressional hearing through the House Oversight Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties to bring greater national attention to this issue. Fortunately, we have a new president, Joe Biden, who took action within his first week in office to issue an executive order that condemns anti-Asian xenophobia and ensures that the Department of Justice works with the AAPI community to address hate crimes and discrimination. But his order is still just the first step, which is why I have requested a meeting with the Department of Justice to follow up on how we can tackle the issue of Chinese profiling as well as anti-Asian bigotry and hate. So while there's so much still to do, I'm hopeful that under the Biden administration, we will be able to make progress in addressing the harmful China initiative and safeguarding the civil rights of Asian Americans. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Representative Chu, and thank you so much for everything you do for the Asian American community and for all the rest of us in Congress and beyond, and looking forward to more action from your side on these issues.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I think we can get started with our panel. I think the way we'll do this today is that we'll start off with a round of questions, and I'll ask each of you a question, and you guys can respond. And I hope that you will feel free to weigh in on each other's responses, and that we can have a conversation, and then we'll open up our conversation to the broader audience. So I'm going to start with you, Les, first of all. So you're a former university president and administrator. So you understand, the world of academia and research and science. And tell us a little bit about what this targeting by the FBI of Chinese Americans looks like on campus, and what your response has been to this.
It's a great question, and it's interesting. San Francisco State University is a research university, 30,000 students with a number of partners throughout the Pacific Rim, and so there was and used to be quite a reward for science researchers to team up with international partners to conduct their research for the benefit of everyone involved. And so I did have experiences with federal enforcement agencies because we had a number of faculty members who traveled often to China, Taiwan, to the Far East, including myself. There were queries about why was the president going so often to Asia, and it was easy to say that we had a large alumni base throughout the Pacific Rim. But my point tonight would be to say I've been very surprised that presidents and chancellors haven't taken a stronger systematic approach by not only protecting their Chinese scientists and researchers, but by developing policies by which a number of systemic offices are involved to prevent the kinds of mistakes that are being pursued by federal agencies. For example, department chairs, deans, the Office of Sponsored Research, and the provost. What we tried to do at San Francisco State was to alert everyone in our pipeline of research that everyone had a role, not only to conduct their research honestly and genuinely, but that we tried to dot every I, cross every T, and be as honest as we could. I had a couple of Chinese researchers that Federal people came and questioned what they were doing, etc. And it finally got to a point where I made a decision that, and I issued this to all employees, that should a federal officer come to your desk in office, that you're not obligated to talk to them, that you should refer them to our chief of police. And the only time in which you needed to be concerned is if they had an actual warrant for a particular person. But if they just came in and saying, you know, we're interested in talking to Professor X who goes to China a lot, they didn't have to say a thing. They called my office, and then we dispatched the campus attorney and the chief of police to talk with those officers. There was some question because San Francisco State had one of the oldest Confucius Institutes. We had a very robust research agenda with Beijing Normal, etc. But we tried to keep everything above board, to be proactive with our faculty members. And for us, it was a systemic piece that if we didn't protect and enhance and support our faculty members, we were not going to put them out there alone to face some of the very similar to the cases that you've read about and which a Congresswoman Chu has referred to. So the idea is that it's an institution that is on the line to establish policies, procedures, etc., to indicate to our Chinese professors that you do have someone who's in your camp, who is interested in your research and interested in protecting you. Part of the problem was the transition that prior to 2016, universities were rewarded for having partnered research relationships with international universities. And all of a sudden that was reversed. And so you had people on NIH, NSF grants, 5-year, 6-year renewable grants that suddenly said, hold it, I've got a partner in China. What do I do now? And so I'm very proud of my provost and Office of Sponsored Research to maneuvering through that transition from a reward system for international partners suddenly to saying, geez, everything you do, you get on a plane to go to Beijing, you're suddenly in someone's radar sight. We made every effort to assure scientists and faculty members that we had their back, that we were looking out for them, and that we expected them to be honest and working with their supervisors to make sure that forms are filled out. As many of you know, most of the cases from the Department of Justice typically involve signing the wrong places on grants. It did not have anything to do with espionage or those other things that I think most of us are against, but simply not filling out forms we thought was a little bit much to suddenly put scientists under the microscope. So for me, the whole issue was a university-wide response to indicate to professors that we had their back. And I want to give a compliment to MIT President Raphael Rafe, because he came out strongly saying that this grant that is under question was between the university and the government and not between an individual scientist. And so I compliment him. There have been some others that have done the same, but nearly not enough leaders of campuses to get out in front of this sort of witch hunt, if you may, of searching out Chinese researchers. So I guess that's my point, is that faculty members, scientists need to know that their university is with them and that we are behind them and we're next to them as they pursue their work.
Thank you. So Karen, as the daughter of the late civil rights icon, Fred Korematsu, you've carried out his legacy as a civil rights advocate. And obviously, every time something happens in the United States, whether it's the targeting of Chinese Americans today, Muslims, we all sort of turn back to World War II example. And it would be just great to hear from you what you think civil society responses to, what civil society can really learn as it figures out how to respond to these issues from the experience of discrimination and incarceration of Japanese Americans.
I have to take myself off mute. Thank you, Faiza. And thank you for asking that question. You know, as Les was talking, I mean, several things came to mind. And the first point that I want to make is, you know, in 1942, at the time of Executive Order 9066, which was issued by President Roosevelt, that you know, that rounded up anyone of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast, right? We just had that anniversary called Day of Remembrance, or DOR, on February 19th, and actually President Biden issued a press release in reinforcing the apology to all Americans. That was the result of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 that President Reagan signed, and that was the official apology to all Americans, you know, for the action of the government, and of course, as well as the reparations. But it was really the apology because everyone had lost their dignity, and 2/3 of the 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were American citizens, and at that time there were not the organizations around available of diversity to speak up on behalf of the Japanese Americans like they are now. The Quakers were very peaceful, a very small group. The ACLU, actually, the national, did not want Mr. Ernest Bessick, who was then the executive director of the Northern California affiliate of the ACLU, to even take on my father's case. He was threatened with ouster because the ACLU position, Roger Baldwin, they were supporting the president. That's what, you know, kind of happens at times of war. And so at least now, the point is we have the organizations and the ability to build these coalitions and to work in solidarity. That's how we make the difference, you know, for the future of this country. And the other thing is that we keep making the same mistakes. We're continually repeating history. You know, we have a campaign called Stop Repeating History, and people, you know, don't know our own history in America. So our organization, the Korematsu Institute, we started in the beginning focusing on education about the Japanese American incarceration, and now we're expanding to other disciplines and even ethnic studies, because, you know, learning about different cultures and religions and those values is what makes America stronger, right? We've had so much prejudice, so people are afraid of what they don't know, and the misinformation, right? And so I always thought, I've been doing this now for about 11 years, and I thought, well, maybe it was just because the students, the young people, didn't know about our history. But I've learned now that Americans don't even know, you know, adults don't even know our own history, going back, especially for Asian Americans, to the Chinese Exclusion Act, you know, for excluding the Chinese and the way that they were treated, you know, Japanese American incarceration, you know, 9/11 and the threat of rounding up Muslim and Arab Americans, and again putting them in American concentration camps, right? And so this is the history, but it's deeper than that, and and so my message is, to know our history. That's how we are able to make those types of policies and to have the kind of advocacy to make change. Because if people don't realize what the marginalization, the racial profiling, right? So this is another with Chinese Americans and it's racial, profiling. So that's what's happening. And with the history, even, bring it down to COVID, we even had a Wisconsin Supreme Court justice named Rebecca Bradley, who cited Korematsu versus the United States as the reason we should lift the stay-at-home order because it was violating people's civil rights. Wrong. I mean, obviously, she does not know the inhumanity of the Japanese American incarceration of World War II. Doesn't know the violation of civil rights, because my father's case in 1944, when it was decided, was a 6-4 decision that went against my father, and it's considered one of the worst Supreme Court decisions ever made in the history of the U.S. So, to have people stay at home for their own health, for themselves, their families, their communities, is not the same as being stripped of your possessions, put into prison camps without any civil rights. So it's knowing our history that's also important. And what also comes to mind is when the scientist, Taiwanese American scientist Wen-Ho Lee, was accused of nuclear espionage, right? So my father spoke out against that because it was another type of racial, profiling and assuming, we assume people are guilty, and this is the mistakes that we continue to make. So we want people to be to be aware of our history so that we can make those kinds of changes. And even members of Congress, I don't know how many people really know of, for instance, about the Japanese American incarceration, the inhumanity and the struggles and the violation of civil rights. It's not just one sentence in a textbook, and that's why Japanese Americans have, after 9/11, spoke up, and like my father did, and said to the government, no, you cannot, racial profile the Muslim Americans because, quote, they look like the enemy. And in this case of anti-Asian violence, it was being associated by the name of a virus, right? But it's this misassociation and targeting that is wrong. That has to stop, and we need to be conscious of the unconscious bias that's happening now, especially because we have more tools in place to make that kind of change, but we need to work together collectively to make those kinds of changes, because at the end of the day, it's about humanity, and it's about being kind, and it's about recognizing that everyone has struggles, and we are more alike than not. And my father was one to say, don't be afraid to speak up, and to stand up for what is right. So for all of us, that's really the message, is to stand up for what is right and to call out these injustices, and to make people accountable for their racism and their prejudice and their violent acts against especially Asian Americans at this time.
Thank you. I mean, I think, as you look at the arc of this, one does wonder whether the reason that we want to make these mistakes again and again, because we keep finding and identifying enemies, right? Whether, and then we go, all out against those enemies and anybody who looks like them, right? as you know, when we were talking about the hate crimes against Asian Americans, I mean, obviously they're not restricted to Chinese Americans. And similarly with Muslims, it wasn't just Muslims who got caught up, Sikhs were caught up, South Asians were caught up, anybody who was vaguely brown was caught up. So I think there's this sort of real kind of interest, and we can talk about whose interest this is really in having this sort of outside enemy, which repeats through US history. I'm going to turn to Becky. Now, Becky, solidarity, working with different movements and different communities that are affected. That's something that's very much, I think, at the heart of what the Leadership Conference does. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how that works and you know, how we can build this together.
So thank you. And I think it's just building off of what Dr. Korematsu was just talking about, that we were looking at, when we first learned about the China initiative and our colleagues at AAJC brought this issue to us, we knew we had to sign on because we know that when there is racial and ethnic profiling against any community, it really does harm us all. And we know that not, in a theoretical perspective or in some sort, but we know it from our experience. The Leadership Conference is an organization of over 220 civil rights organizations that has come together across different communities to fight to make our country as good as its ideals. And what we knew and what we've learned from over those 70 years is we've seen this before. As Dr. Korematsu just said, stop repeating history. We know this. So whether it is, one of the things we talk about a lot is that when we talk about sort of what is trying to divide us, it is white supremacy. So I think when you were talking, Faiza, about sort of what is it that continues to come back, that continues to seek another to blame, that is sort of at the root of all of this. And it is also at the root, and what's so powerful, of why communities are coming together across the very same communities that are targeted for hate. So whether it's Asian American T community are coming together to say, this country can be better. And they are putting their lives on the line to do that. And I think that's one of the things that's been sort of most powerful about this. When I think back, when we were talking about sort of where we've seen this before so many times, thinking about after 9/11, and we saw in the Leadership Conference at that time, about a month after 9/11, when the Patriot Act first was introduced, we said, we've seen this before. You are going to introduce these policies, these new powers, and they will be used to target the communities, the very same communities that, for example, white nationalists are targeting. We knew that it would target the Muslim community, the South Asian community, the Sikh community, and we raised these concerns. And part of what we talked about was in our history, we looked at COINTELPRO. So again, that's the program that in the 60s, it was under the guise of national security, was used to target Dr. Martin Luther King. So part of what was important for us as a civil rights organization and as a leadership conference was to say, we've seen this before, and this does not only does it not work, but it affirmatively harms our communities in so many different ways. How does it harm our communities? One is that you're not actually, we're not actually going after the real threats. When you're targeting people because of their race, because of their ethnic origin, because they put their signature on the wrong line, you're missing the real threats. If anything, we should learn from what happened on January 6th. Nationally, the greatest threat to the United States is white supremacy. The greatest threat is violent white nationalists. So we are diverting resources from actually focusing on the real threat, meanwhile targeting those very same communities that are targeted. So I think that's one real way it harms. And I think the other way, and I think this has been mentioned by all of my co-panelists, is the increase in hate crimes. So after September 11th, this data point is somewhat stunning. I will, at some point, especially because I imagine there are a lot of scientists on the line, so every time I talk about data, generally people's eyes glaze over, but with this group, you guys, I might actually have you with this. The FBI's hate crimes data is woefully inadequate. We know that for many reasons, and we can definitely talk about that, but it does at least give us a sense of where things are going. We can get trends from it. In 2000, there were 28 recorded hate crimes committed against Muslims. In 2001, there were 481. It continued. So before September 11th, the Muslim hate crimes used to be the second least reported among anti-religious hate crimes. Now they are the second most. So I think there is a real harm. And as everyone was talking about before, and including the Congresswoman, when you use rhetoric, when you use language like that, it matters. And when you have government programs that profile and that treat people as suspects because of who they are, because of their ethnic origin, that also encourages hate. And so I I think in particular now, in hearing from so many of my colleagues and thinking about the real fear that is across the API community right now, and in particular after the assaults on elders, it is critical that we think about every way that we, both as communities, can come together, but also can demand that our government take actions to stop treating people as suspects and to make sure that we are recognizing and supporting people for all the contributions that they bring. So I think for all of those reasons, we felt like as a leadership conference, it was critical that we weigh in both on the China initiative and that we continue to lift up the work of extraordinary colleagues in API-led organizations that are doing really critical work now.
Thank you, Becky, and all of you. You know, one of the things that I think about as I look at this thing is it, how do you deal with sort of tensions among communities, right? And that's definitely, I think, something that we all have to think about, right? Because we're trying to build solidarity, right, across different people. And a lot of times, you know, people want to put their community first, right? They're, you know, and I've seen this many times, right? Whether people think that the things that they face are the most real to them. They want to grapple with those particular issues. So what is the sort of way to kind of bridge that, to sort of take the sort of self-interestedness, if you will, of different communities and sort of merge it in a way that the sum is greater than the whole of its parts? What are some sort of tactics? Do people have ideas?
Yeah, I'll say quickly, you know, our experience at the Leadership Conference has really been the opposite, right? And I think I want to highlight that. One important thing is to note, I mean, you're absolutely right that there is that tendency. And again, I will go back to, that is one of the most pernicious effects of white supremacy, is to divide the very same communities that are being targeted. But we have seen, I mean, I think, you know, if you look at, for example, we are partnering through a campaign we have called Black Justice is Our Justice, which talks about how anti-Blackness drives a lot of racism, discrimination against many communities. Mm-hmm. One of our key partners is Act to Change, which is an API organization that helps to address hate and bias targeting young people. And there, in this moment, this weekend, they will be having a conversation where they are talking about how do you combat anti-Blackness in our communities in order to make us all stronger. So I think one of the things is, going back to Dr. Korematsu's point about education, that is absolutely critical. But it's also making sure that we're getting out these stories of solidarity, of real solidarity, where we are seeing in Oakland, for example, Black leaders coming out to say, this is not going to happen in our community without us saying something. So I do think people, and I think that the example, I mean, after 9/11, the extraordinary contributions of Japanese Americans to stand up and say, this is not happening, this won't happen on my watch again. Like those kinds of contributions made a really big difference. So I think, you know, I think part of it is around education. I also think, for example, the Japanese American Citizens League has been one of the strongest supporters for reparations for African Americans. So I think part of it is just elevating the fact that there is this sense of common common purpose, of common understanding that once any of us are attacked, we are all attacked. But also looking at our history and seeing that this is white supremacy in action. If we let them divide us, if we let them act like, you know, I can say as a Jew, if I let people say, well, you know, if you do this, then you're not going to be supporting another community, I am letting white supremacists win. And when we come together, we have seen the power, and it's really reflected, I think, in my other panelists as well. So.
Faiza, what I would say is exactly what Becky just pointed out. You know, is especially now we have HR 40, right? Which is we're pushing to get that passed through Congress. So, which is I mean, in this case, really, it would allow a commission to start hearings, right, about redress and reparations for African Americans, especially those families that were, you know, enslaved, right? That's the whole point. And we need as a country to be purposeful in addressing these wrongs if we're going to move forward. And that's where the Japanese American, you know, redress and reparations movement that finally passed, you know, as I mentioned, with the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 that was signed by President Reagan. You know, that's where the Japanese American community is partnering and offering our support to to the African American community, and all the other organizations that are working on this HR 40, because we know what those struggles were like, and we can make that change. It's going to take a lot of work. It doesn't happen overnight, but if we work together, because at that time there were many organizations that came out in support of the Civil Liberties Act, of Japanese Americans and the redress and reparations movement, because they have experienced that marginalization in their own communities. And so that's how you make that connection, right? Sharing those stories and focusing on how you can help. Because we all have stories. We all have individual stories. We need to know our own stories so we can appreciate other people's stories and other people's history. And that's where we can make that connection. And when you help others, you also help yourself. And that's what I'm always trying to impress upon young people, especially that are trying to find their place in the world. And they can make a difference. I mean, Fred Korematsu was one person who made a difference in the face of adversity, is what I say. And so can they, and so can you. And that's what we need to keep in mind, is how we can make this country stronger when we have those opportunities to do so.
And I think that's right, because not only is it, as we've said, all of us, that it's sort of white supremacy trying to divide us, but the tactics are also the same over and over again. And unless, coming to you now, I was reading this op-ed that Lee Bollinger, the president of Columbia University, had penned in opposition to the pressure that he was feeling from the Justice Department to basically rat out his own students and faculty and postdocs. And he was saying, well, it's not who we are, right? We are, we as a sort of, the head of an academic institution, as a professor, I shouldn't be asked to spy on my students and my postdocs and my professors, and they shouldn't be asked to spy on each other either. And it reminded me when I read that about, some of the countering violent extremism programs that have been part of the counterterrorism architecture, where the government, and this is the Obama administration, basically went out and told Muslim communities, you need to be reporting each other. And you need to be telling us who among you might be a terrorist, which was also a terrible idea, but just the sort of the way the tactics are so similar really resonated with me. And I'm just curious, Les, if you can talk a little bit about, what does that, like, when you're in an academic institution and you're feeling this pressure to be kind of watching each other, how does that work? I mean, how does that not work? And what are the things that, the university can do to push back against that? So not just this sort of FBI coming in and directly questioning people, but also this sort of overall creating an atmosphere of fear and like breaking down some of those kind of bonds that people have when they work together.
You're raising a great point. One of the pieces of the curriculum that I've been very excited by is the increasing appearance of social justice programs that are based in helping students learn how to build alliances, how to be peacemakers, the growth of restorative justice programs. I learned very clearly at San Francisco State that the concerns of students were loud. They teamed up. They came to my office, and I came to understand that their concerns weren't with me. The concerns were aspirational. They had expectations that an education, a city, a government, whatever you want to call it, had a responsibility to be value-driven in ways that benefited everyone. And that's a hard notion. And I think that's why restorative justice is becoming a very attractive piece for young people, because, you know, and one of my mentors said it's always been easy to make war. It is really, really hard to learn how to make peace. And it requires just a lot of self-awareness and group awareness. And I think you're starting to see a lot of college curriculums build that in. I'm very proud the CSU, who instituted an ethnic studies requirement, students hate requirements, right? But you know, this one really is headed in the right direction to help people understand the notion of what communities go through. And I'm hoping that the growth of that will lead to how community building isn't among people whom are like you, but it's people who share ideals and aspirations with you, and they might very well be a different gender, a different background, you know, just a whole lot of differences, but they share with you an aspirational goal that we expect better. And I think that's the challenge of today and tomorrow's curriculum is how do you wrap chemistry and physics and sociology and psychology to at least encompass that humanity, that we have higher goals for people. And I think that's what young people are telling us.
You know, coming back, I mean, I think we're talking today a lot about solidarity, although we haven't said the intersectionality word yet. So, but you know, one thing I remember, you know, after the 2016 election, and being absolutely terrified about what was to come. But the one thing I remember that really gave me solace was I thought about the fact, and this is to your point, Becky, that over the previous, 10 plus years, we had all been building an infrastructure and solidarity so that, yes, a lot of people helped the Muslim community after 9/11, but come Trump, the infrastructure and the connections and the relationships were so well established that we were like a well-oiled machine. And to your point around, you know, sort of understanding other people who look different like you but share the same values. I remember being really moved at the protests at airports when the Muslim ban went up, and where we had, you know, rallies, you know, week after week and in cities across the United States. And that was a real, I mean, in some sense, you know, Trump almost like forced solidarity on us because he made it so clear that we were all in this together. So I think that's definitely, you know, a lesson that I've learned. You know, I want to give us just a few minutes. I'd love to hear, and this is something that folks have, many of the questioners have been asking about too, right? Which is, you know, what are the kinds of things that you think are important for people to be doing in order to, you know, to be good neighbors, to be good friends, to be good Americans together, to, you know, really kind of move this ball forward? Or alternatively, you could maybe talk about, you know, whether there are sort of specific legal or policy, or even in the academic world, you know, Les, you mentioned, you know, there's not enough cooperation. Like, so what are the kinds of, sort of maybe talk about the big picture changes you'd like to happen, and maybe if you could take a minute or two to talk about like what could individuals do, because that's very much a theme I see coming through.
I'll be really brief. I don't want to hog the bandwidth here. You know, for me, I've been involved in community building, et cetera, and it breaks down to knowing who your neighbors are. You know, saying hi, you know, getting to know who's next to you. And that's, for me, that's the ripple that starts, because suddenly you're getting on buses and trains and just being aware of appreciating people who are different from you, who are around you, they're part of your neighborhood. There was a lot of sociological research early in the 60s and 70s about familiar strangers, and the fact that the network of a community is, first of all, knowing who's there, you know, and so I'm fairly new to Worcester, Massachusetts right now, but the number of community activities has been absolutely wonderful. And I think that's the beginning of how you get to build momentum from all politics being local to something being much more dramatic.
Can I just ask you a follow-up question though? You know, one thing that you said in your opening remarks where you're like, well, you know, I don't understand why there isn't greater coordination, right? At least that's what I understood you to say, that you have some university presidents speaking out. Now we know that the government has great coordination, right? They've got a whole initiative, and you know, the DOJ and the FBI are all signed on. They've got their strategy documents, they're out there. So what is the barrier? What is preventing these university presidents to come together and say, you know, what's going on with, you know, our Chinese scientists and academics and our Chinese American colleagues is just flat wrong. And we should take coordinated action against it. And so I'm just curious as to why that hasn't happened, or maybe it's happened and I don't know about it, but.
Yeah, the president and chancellor's job is really a complex one. And, you know, I don't want to speak out about, you know, regarding other communities, et cetera, but, you know, presidents want students to get a hold of their aspirations and their relationships. I just genuinely believe that. And that's what education is meant to do. But it's very hard. And it differs all across the country and across the planet, and how how it comes up and abuts things like religious differences, age differences, gender differences, political party differences. And that's why I often believe that the heart and soul of transformation begins locally. You know, how active are you in your community? Are you voting? Are you getting out to attend school meetings and district meetings? And you know, that involvement is just invaluable. Suddenly you realize that the person who lived 2 blocks from you shares some similar aspirations, and we don't nearly do enough of that. And I'm not sure what the cause is. I'd like to blame technology for that, but you know, for me, it's really getting to know people who are around you, who probably aren't like you in many ways, but just getting out there.
Thank you. Karen, you know, you mentioned a number of sort of legislative initiatives that you're supporting and that you're in favor of. So maybe you could just sort of give a quick rundown of like a couple of the ones that are closest to you, so that our audience really hears that, and maybe think about it. There's a couple of pieces of advice you want to give people listening today about how they can also further this work.
Well, yeah, thank you, Faiza. It's interesting because I will use intersectionality as a point, because, and I just kind of, I think briefly mentioned ethnic studies. And of course, for you know, universities, I mean, some have departments, some don't. And for California, I think for the community colleges, we had a bill that was passed. And now what we're trying to do is have ethnic studies as a graduating requirement for high school students. Now, you know, I'm in California, but I work nationally. So I work with the National Council for Social Studies. I work with all the social studies leads in each state, and it varies. You know, it really is it's very inconsistent. But I was really quite surprised to learn that not even California had this requirement of you know, at least 1 semester of ethnic studies for high school students, and the point is learning the intersectionality of our history, right? And as I said, and to learn about the different cultures, African American, indigenous, the American Indians, Latinx, even the Jewish community, Japanese, and API communities, and their cultures and the history in this country, and that's how we learn how to work together. We haven't had a basis of really working together, of understanding, like I said, each other's differences, and you can agree to disagree. I mean, that's okay, but it's also, we need to be purposeful in getting, it's even getting to know, our neighbor who is different than us. As Les was saying, know your neighbor. Well, what about, what is their story? And that's important. And I think to share each other's experiences, especially the history of this marginalization of our history in this country, is going to be important to move forward. And also, I also say that, really, actually, there's social justice in all aspects of life and career. And we should focus on that, it's not just chemistry, and it's not just a topic of chemical balances and all that, but it's more than that, right? Because you have a responsibility as humans. That's what makes us different, to make those kinds of decisions. And if we're going to ever, I'm pushing, for racial equity and just equity in general. Well, how do we do that? Well, we have to, be mindful that that we're more complicated, that there's more issues, that there's more decisions to be made about our humanity in these different careers that we take on, and that's, sometimes I feel like that's what's missed, and that's what the kind of thing I'm working on. Also, I want to, as individuals, because I guess the positive side, if you will, of COVID is, when we saw George Floyd, who was being murdered. I mean, there was all these videos going on, and that has been helpful to bring justice. And so there's a organization, and actually the Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, is also supporting this hollaback bystander harassment training, which I encourage everyone to take. And there's different ones for Asian Americans, Latinx, African Americans, LGBTQ, and it's helpful to, when you're out there and you're seeing someone who there's some type of violence or some type of act, someone is harassing someone, to know how to take that harassment away from the power of that person, and to channel it. So whether you're taking a video or distracting, there's the 5 Ds of how you can make the difference. Reporting, like you can report these incidences to the leadership conference, to Advancing Justice AAJC, to that helps to make those changes. So I encourage everyone to take responsibility for yourself in going forward, to have the tools available when you need them to act on behalf of your neighbor.
Thank you. That is very inspiring. Becky, I'm going to ask you to do a quick one so we can get some audience questions in. That's it. Thank you.
So I would echo what my fellow panelists said. I think a couple of quick things. When we think about it at the federal legislative level, the things we're thinking about actually reflect exactly what Dr. Wong and Dr. Korematsu were just talking about. So for example, reparations is about education. It's about understanding our history and understanding how as you mentioned before, intersectional that history is, how the reason we are here, and when we are combating anti-Asian hate, we are combating anti-Muslim hate, we are also combating the same kind of anti-Blackness that was at our founding. And I think that helps a lot. We've talked a lot, so we also support something called the Commission for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, That's something that Congresswoman Barbara Lee has been pushing, and it is really important. Again, it's about history, but it's also about coming together. And it goes back to what Dr. Wong was saying. It's about local communities. It's about recognizing that if we are going to really reckon with our history of white supremacy, our history of how it has tried to pull our country apart, we will also then learn to reckon with who has been fighting to make our country as good as its ideals, who has been fighting to make our country what its aspirations, about our shared aspirations. And that is often, it is the very same communities that have been targeted for hate. So, the 1619 Project, I think, is something that many people have talked about, but that helped us to realize that. And so I think there is a moment of horrific reckoning with white supremacy, but through that, we see this really, really big opportunity. So I think, hopefully our federal sort of priorities reflect what we think can happen in local communities.
Thank you. So we have lots of action in the chat and only a very few minutes to get to all of it. So let me ask you just a couple of quick ones. I already got to the one issue that what can we all do about this? Let me see, I have some little notes over here. I think we've hit several of these themes already. The question here is, someone says, this year's Nobel Prize on CRISPR was awarded to two collaborating scientists who work together. Collaboration is essential in research for the advancement of science. It seems Chinese scientists are persecuted for the same collaboration that other researchers have been doing regularly. Can you comment on how this affected the collaboration with Chinese researchers? Les, do you want to take that one?
That's a big question. COVID has changed the rules for just a lot of different things. And particularly in the biosciences, et cetera, and particularly for drug-related research. It's still my opinion that collaborative research will produce results faster than any isolated lab situated anywhere on the planet. You've got to get the best minds at the table in the lab to look, and they have to be unfettered by politic and other sorts of things. And we were moving down that road, and it suddenly went away. And it's just a difficult question. I tend to look at the collaboration, particularly around science, and the CRISPR research is particularly interesting because we're starting to have knowledge and technology about some very fundamental issues about what life is, what it means to be healthy, et cetera. And that's going to require a very broad input into that question. And you might think it's about different countries, et cetera, but I think ethicists trained in different religions need to be brought into the question to start looking at some of this genetics research that you mentioned in the CRISPR work. And we think it's kind of easy because we're using it on other animals, et cetera. I think the enormity of the ethics question is still to be sort of thought about in big ways. But I think getting multilateral, international cooperative relationships will get us down the line much, much faster than isolating it to countries and politics.
So speaking of countries and politics, someone raises the issue about, looking at the sort of persecution of particular communities over time and tying that into sort of the broader geopolitical aims of the United States. That seems like something that's pretty evident to me, but I don't know if anyone would care to comment on that. Becky, you look like you might be ready.
I just want to make sure I understand. As you may have seen, I have a coworker who has been also.
Yes, of course.
My 5-year-old coworker.
We're talking about ethnic minorities being targeted, right? We're talking about Japanese Americans, we're talking about Muslims, now we're talking about Chinese. And, we can look at it as a domestic issue, or we can look at it in the broader international context, right? So war, security, but not just the fact that there's conflict, but that the sort of internal imperatives kind of match the external imperatives. So how do we fight that? Because in some sense, you know, like in my own work, I focused very much on domestic US stuff. So I don't really work on torture. I don't really work on drones. I don't really work on endless wars. But frankly, they frame all of the work, you know, around what we're doing with Muslim and South Asian and Arab communities in the United States, because if we're at war over there, we're going to be at war over here, right? So I think it's a great point to think about, is how these things intersect.
I think that's a great point. I mean, I think actually our current interim president of the Leadership Conference, Wade Henderson, changed our name to the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights at one point. And I think partly to recognize the way that these issues often intersect. You know, one really specific example today, you know, Faiza, your colleague at the Brennan Center, and my boss at the Leadership Conference, were talking about the rise of domestic terrorism, and the focus there was about sort of how, you know, we have ignored the white nationalist threat in terms of talking about what is domestic terrorism. But what we really started thinking about and looking at is the tools that were created are tools that have consistently been used to target minority communities, have consistently been abused. And in some ways, they are often created because they are raised sort of this you know, sort of this broader threat that is sort of put before us of someone from the outside, someone from the other. And I think when we think about also the increase in hate crimes, we knew, because of whenever there's an economic downturn, we know that immigrants are increasingly targeted. There is always a desire to find someone who is other to blame. So I think that, you know, I think it is imperative on us to sort of recognize, again, what's at stake here, which is we can't be played in that way. So we shouldn't be sort of convinced that because you know, that there are these threats, and they're often real threats outside of the outside, but that when we cannot control those and we start to target people who represent the other, and that is directly contrary to who we are as a country, and again, who we are in terms of what our aspirations are and what the United States is. We are indeed a country. When people after what happened on January 6th, after George Floyd was murdered, people will say, this is not who we are. This is who we are. We have to acknowledge that. This is part of who we are as a country, but the power of who we are as a country is that it is not who we have to always be. If we are willing to reckon with that history, if we are willing to reckon with the way in which we sort of take external threats and use them and target people who are the very same people who are trying to make our country stronger, that we will fail. So I think, so I don't know if that's, but I hear what you're saying. And I think often I was thinking today when we were talking about domestic terrorism, all of these sort of ideas would come up with this threat that we can sort of challenge on the outside. Whereas often what we need to do is really think about how we can work together to make sure that our laws, the laws that we have control over, the members of Congress who we elect, the president that we elect, the local city council that we elect, actually have the power to address some of the greatest threats, which are often within.
Well, I think that's a great place for us to end, because otherwise I'm going to be in trouble for not ending on time. But I want to thank each and every one of you. You've all been great companions in this program tonight. And I think that, you know, you've given us a really inspiring message and some concrete ideas about, you know, how we might engage. Les, I love your idea of like talking to your neighbors. It's a bit harder when you're wearing a mask and it's COVID times, but you know, this too shall pass and we shall talk to our neighbors. And I really appreciate that, because I think you're right, you know, particularly in cities, you know, you live with, you know, lots of different kinds of people. You may not work with lots of different kinds of people, but you live with lots of different kinds of people. And I think that's a really excellent piece of advice for people. There are a lot of resources, and you know, folks have put them, some of them have put them in the chat, and you know, I would encourage you to look, for example, at AAJC's website. They have bystander trainings available over there, for example. Becky put up something about Black Justice is ourjustice.org, which is also a great place to look. I would encourage you to look at the work that Karen Korematsu has done, because it is truly inspiring to, sort of see how she's built this institution, and maybe you'll get some ideas over there. If you're a student or you're an academic or you're involved in academic institutions, you surely have many, many outlets for making your voice heard. And remember those things, in addition to just doing your studies, to also do some studying for justice. And that would, I think, ways in which we can all contribute to this. So I'm going to end by thanking all of you so very, very much for for taking the time to speak tonight, for taking the time to listen tonight and to engage with us and to come up with these great questions. I want to thank all the folks who are in the background there, making sure that this Zoom conference is running well. Thank you, Stephen, Jeremy, Mike, Vince. You've been really helpful through all of this. And I, on behalf of the Brennan Center and our co-sponsoring organizations, which is luckily a long list reflective of our solidarity. So it's the AAJC, the APA Justice Task Force. Oh my gosh, tell me I haven't lost the list. Sorry, here we go. United Chinese Americans and the Asian Pacific Islander American Public Affairs. Thank you so much on behalf of all of us for joining today. Take this message of solidarity and hope and go forth, and let's make some change. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Faiza.
Yes, thank you, Faiza. You were fantastic. Thank you so much.
No, thank you guys. It was such a great talk to have. I'm not usually a fan of 8 p.m. panels,